Imagine waking before dawn inside a one-room timber cottage, the air so cold that your breath hangs in a pale cloud above your face, and the only light comes from a single dying ember buried in ash at the center of the room. Outside, the wind claws at the walls like something alive, and beneath the frozen thatch above your head, ice has begun to creep along the inside of the roof beams. It is the winter of 1315, and across the villages of northern Europe, families are waking to the same silence, the same cold, and the same quiet, gnawing question. Will the food stored since autumn be enough to see them through to spring? This was not an ordinary winter. It arrived on the heels of a summer that refused to behave like one. Rain had fallen for weeks without pause the year before, drowning fields that should have been golden with wheat and barley. Rivers swelled beyond their banks. Grain rotted in the ground before it could be harvested. And as the harvest failed, so too did the fragile margin between a village having enough and a village having nothing. Historians now recognize this period as the opening chapter of what would become known as the Great Famine, a catastrophe that stretched from roughly 1315 to 1317 and touched nearly every corner of medieval Europe. But long before anyone had a name for it, the people living through it simply called it hunger, and they called it cold, and they set about doing what they had always done in hard years: enduring. To understand how they survived, we first have to understand the world they survived in. A typical peasant home in this period was not the picturesque cottage of later imagination, but a modest, practical structure built from what the land provided. Timber frames, often oak, formed the skeleton of the house, while the spaces between the beams were filled with wattle and daub, a woven lattice of thin branches packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, left to dry into a surprisingly effective barrier against the wind. Roofs were thatched with reeds or straw, layered thickly enough to shed rain and, when packed with snow, to actually help insulate the home rather than let heat escape. Floors were usually bare earth, sometimes strewn with straw that could be swept out and replaced when it grew damp or foul. If you're enjoying this journey into the world of medieval survival, this is a good moment to subscribe, because what comes next reveals just how resourceful these communities had to become when the temperature dropped and the food ran low. At the heart of nearly every home stood the hearth, and at the heart of every household's winter survival stood the fire that burned within it. Keeping that fire alive was not a convenience. It was a matter of life and death. Many homes had no chimney at all, at least not in the modern sense. Smoke rose from the central hearth and drifted upward, curling along the blackened roof beams before finding its way out through a small gap or louvre in the thatch, or simply seeping through the roof itself. This is why the interior beams of so many surviving medieval structures are stained a deep, permanent black, the residue of thousands of small fires, tended night after night for generations. The smoke was uncomfortable, and it stung the eyes of anyone unaccustomed to it, but it served a purpose beyond simple warmth. It helped preserve the thatch above by driving away insects and slowing the rot that dampness could bring, and it seeped into stored meats and cheeses hung near the rafters, helping to keep them edible through the long months ahead. Firewood itself was not something to be gathered in a panic once the snow began to fall. Villagers understood, through generations of hard experience, that autumn was the season to prepare for a winter that would not forgive carelessness. Wood was cut, split, and stacked against the walls of the cottage, or under a lean-to shelter, arranged so that the driest pieces would be used first, and the more stubborn, greener wood would have time to season before it was needed. Peat, where it was available, particularly in parts of the British Isles and the Low Countries, was cut in blocks during the warmer months and dried for use as a slow-burning alternative to wood. Every log, every block of peat represented hours of labor invested months earlier, and a family that had failed to gather enough by the first frost faced a winter of borrowed fuel, rationed fires, and cold nights that could prove deadly to the very young and the very old. Clothing formed the next line of defense against the season, and it was far more sophisticated than many people today assume. Wool was the great workhorse fabric of the medieval world, valued for its ability to retain warmth even when damp, and it was worn in layers rather than as a single heavy garment. A peasant might wear a linen undershirt against the skin, prized because it could be washed and helped wick moisture away from the body, topped with a woolen tunic and then a heavier woolen overtunic or cloak. Hoods were essential, often attached directly to a cloak or worn separately, since so much body heat is lost through an uncovered head. Mittens, rather than gloves with individual fingers, were common among laborers because they kept the fingers together and warmer while still allowing enough dexterity for basic tasks. Those who could afford it lined their garments with fur, rabbit, fox, or sheepskin, while wealthier villagers or those with connections to trade might have access to more exotic furs. Footwear typically consisted of leather shoes or boots, sometimes stuffed with straw for insulation, worn over woolen hose that climbed the leg. None of this made the cold comfortable, but it made it survivable, and every layer was the product of careful, deliberate craft passed down through families who had no room for wasted effort. Bedding followed the same logic of layered practicality. Straw-filled mattresses, sometimes called pallets, provided a barrier between the sleeper and the cold earth or wooden floor beneath. Wool blankets and animal hides were piled atop these pallets, and in many households, the warmth of shared body heat was itself a survival strategy. Family members, and sometimes even livestock in the case of the poorest households, sleeping in close proximity to conserve warmth through the coldest nights. In some regions, animals were kept in an adjoining section of the house itself, separated from the human living space by only a low partition, a practical arrangement that allowed the heat generated by cattle, pigs, or goats to help warm the home, while also keeping a close eye on animals whose survival was just as critical to the household's future as its own. And speaking of animals, the care of livestock through winter was one of the most demanding responsibilities a village faced, and one that reveals just how tightly human survival was bound to the survival of the creatures they depended on. Because pasture disappeared beneath snow and frozen ground, animals that could not be sustained through the winter were often slaughtered in the autumn, their meat salted, smoked, or preserved in other ways to last through the cold months. This is precisely why autumn slaughter was such a significant seasonal event across medieval Europe, not a single feast, but a practical necessity that determined how many mouths, human and animal alike, a household could realistically feed until spring. The animals that were kept through winter, usually breeding stock or working animals essential to the coming year's labor, required hay and stored fodder gathered during the summer months, and keeping them warm and alive often meant the difference between a village that could plant and plow when spring arrived and one that could not. Now, before we go further into the daily rhythms of winter survival, if you're finding yourself fascinated by just how intricately these communities organize their lives around the seasons, take a moment to like this video. It helps others discover these hidden layers of medieval history too. Food, of course, sat at the very center of winter survival, and the autumn of 1314 had already delivered a warning that few villages could ignore. The relentless rain that had ruined the harvest meant that granaries which should have been full were instead dangerously thin. Rye and wheat, the staple grains from which daily bread was baked, were in short supply, and many households found themselves stretching what grain they had by mixing it with oats, barley, or even ground peas and beans to make the flour last longer. Bread itself, often dense and dark, formed the backbone of most meals, frequently accompanied by pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and occasionally scraps of preserved meat a household had on hand. Onions, turnips, and cabbages, robust vegetables that could be stored through winter in cool, dry spaces, found their way into these pots again and again, providing both substance and the illusion of variety in a diet that by the depths of winter had grown remarkably repetitive. Dairy products, where available, offered another crucial source of nutrition. Cheese, made in the more abundant months and aged through autumn, could last well into winter, as could butter, which was sometimes salted to extend its usable life. Smoked or salted fish, particularly in coastal or riverside communities, provided protein when meat from livestock was scarce or being carefully rationed. And rationing, in the truest sense of the word, became an unavoidable part of daily life as winter wore on. Households learned, often through painful experience, to portion out their stores with an eye not just to the coming week, but to the uncertain months still ahead, because there was no way to know for certain when the thaw would come or whether it would arrive before their supplies ran out entirely. Community cooperation became essential in these circumstances, and it is one of the more remarkable, if less visible, aspects of medieval winter survival. Villages functioned as tightly interdependent networks rather than collections of isolated households. A family that had lost a portion of their harvest to disease or misfortune might receive support from neighbors who had fared slightly better, with the understanding, spoken or unspoken, that fortunes could just as easily reverse in another season. The village priest often played a quiet but significant role here, not only offering spiritual guidance and the comfort of familiar religious ritual through the dark winter months, but sometimes coordinating charitable distribution of food or resources to widows, orphans, and the elderly who had no household of able-bodied workers to rely upon. Winter religious observances, including the feasts and fasts of the church calendar, provided rhythm and meaning to the season, giving villagers moments of communal gathering and shared purpose even as the days grew shortest and darkest. Daily life did not simply pause because the ground had frozen. Water still needed to be fetched, though wells and streams often required breaking through a crust of ice each morning, a task usually given to children or younger members of the household who could manage the walk to the water source and back before the cold became unbearable. Tools required maintenance, since a broken plow or a cracked axe handle discovered in the depths of winter could not easily be replaced and needed repair using whatever materials and skills were on hand. Indoors, the winter months became a season of textile work, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth on simple looms, and mending garments that had worn thin, tasks that filled the long, dim hours when outdoor labor was limited by weather and daylight alike. Storytelling filled these same hours, passed down through voice rather than the written word for most peasant families, keeping alive local histories, religious tales, and practical knowledge that would be needed again once the frost finally broke. Children experienced this world differently than adults did. Too young to carry the full weight of the household's survival, they nonetheless learned early the rhythms of winter labor, watching and gradually assisting with tasks like tending the fire, feeding smaller livestock, or helping to card wool before it was spun. Winter could also be a season of genuine hardship for the youngest villagers, more vulnerable to the cold and to the diseases that spread more easily when families were confined together for warmth in close, smoky quarters. Elders, meanwhile, held a different kind of value through these months. Their accumulated knowledge of which foods could be safely foraged even in a lean year, of how to read the signs of weather, of remedies for the coughs and chills that inevitably spread through a cold household, made them indispensable sources of guidance, even as the winter itself was often hardest on their aging bodies. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a village after a heavy snowfall, one that anyone living through the winter of 1315 would have known intimately. The wind, so constant and cutting in the open months, seems to hold its breath. Sound itself becomes muffled, swallowed by the snow blanketing the fields and rooftops. Inside the cottages, the only sounds might be the soft crackle of the hearth fire, the occasional creak of a timber door swelling and contracting in the cold, and the low murmur of a family speaking quietly by candlelight, the flickering flame casting long shadows against smoke-darkened walls. Frost sometimes formed on the inside of shuttered windows or along the edges of stone foundations, a visible reminder of just how thin the boundary was between the warmth people fought to maintain and the killing cold pressing in from every side. But the winter of 1315 was not simply cold. It was, for many communities, the beginning of genuine starvation. As the weeks stretched into months and the failed harvest's consequences deepened, the careful rationing that had sustained households through the early winter began to fail. Grain reserves that villagers had hoped would last until spring planting instead ran dangerously low well before the thaw. Prices for what food remained available at markets and fairs climbed beyond what many poorer families could afford, and the gap between the villages that had managed their stores wisely and those that had not grew starkly, painfully visible. Historians studying this period have found evidence of widespread malnutrition, weakened immune systems that left populations more vulnerable to illness, and in the most severely affected regions, genuine famine deaths, particularly among the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by poverty before the crisis began. This was not a single catastrophic winter in isolation. It was the opening act of a famine that would, in the following 2 years, continue to grind down communities across a wide swath of Europe before conditions finally began to improve. And yet, even within this hardship, there is a lesser-known detail that deserves attention. The crisis of 1315 pushed many communities to innovate and adapt in ways that would shape agricultural and social practices for years afterward. Some villages began experimenting more seriously with alternative grains better suited to poor weather, or adjusted their planting schedules in the years following the famine to hedge against another such catastrophic season. The shared memory of scarcity lingered in community practices, influencing how future harvests were stored and distributed, a quiet but lasting legacy of a winter that no one who lived through it would soon forget. As the darkest months of the year gradually gave way to the slow, uncertain turning of the season, the first genuine signs of spring would have felt almost unbelievable to those who had endured the winter of 1315. A softening in the air, icicles along the eaves beginning to drip in the weak but returning sunlight, the frozen crust of rivers and streams cracking and shifting, water moving audibly beneath the surface for the first time in months, buds forming, tentative and small, on the bare branches of trees that had stood skeletal and silent since autumn. For villagers who had spent months rationing food, tending fires through bitter nights, and caring for both family and livestock against the relentless pressure of the cold, these small signs were not simply seasonal changes. They were confirmation, hard-won and deeply felt, that survival had been possible after all. But the winter's effects did not vanish with the melting snow. Fields needed to be replanted, often with weakened seed stock and by farmers themselves diminished by months of hunger and hard labor. Communities that had lost members to the famine carried that absence into the seasons that followed, and the economic strain of the crisis would linger for years, shaping decisions about food storage, trade, and community support long after the immediate danger had passed. The Great Famine that had begun with this brutal winter would continue to test medieval Europe for several more years before finally releasing its grip. If there is one thing the winter of 1315 makes clear, it is this. Survival in the medieval world was rarely the result of a single clever solution or a moment of heroism. It was the slow, patient accumulation of preparation, skill, community, and endurance, practiced daily by ordinary people who rarely saw themselves as remarkable, even as they quietly did remarkable things simply to see their families through to another spring. What aspect of this winter surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and if you'd like to journey further into historically grounded reconstructions of life in the medieval world, subscribe for more.